In the book of Samuel, Shmuel, we have a story about King Saul and Amalek. King Saul went to war against Amalek. The king of Amalek was named Agag, and Shmuel told Saul to kill all the Amalekites and to burn, to destroy anything of value that they had. And one day, Shmuel is standing near King Saul, and he hears the sound of cattle. Ba, ba, ba. And he looks at the king and says, "What do I hear?" And King Saul says, "Well, you know, Shmuel, look, a Yid is a Yid. What am I going to do? I saw that Agag, the king of Amalek, and all his cattle and all his wealth, it doesn't make sense just to destroy them. I let him live." And Shmuel got very angry. And as you find in his book, he took a knife and he killed Agag, the king of Amalek. And he also told King Saul, "You've had it, kid. The kingdom will no longer be yours." If you want, look it up. It's an interesting story. What does that have to do with us? Here we go. We find as follows in the second chapter of the Megillah. Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Habira. There was a Jewish man in Shushan. Ushmo, and his name is Mordechai, ben Yair, ben Shim'i, ben Kish, Ish Yemini. Wait a minute. Mordechai, Shevet Binyamin, ben Kish. Kish. Saul's father's name was Kish. Shaul ben Kish. And wait a minute. Mordechai, ben Shim'i, ben Yair, ben Kish, Ish Yemini. And later on we're going to find out that he will be fighting with a guy named Haman ben Hamdata Ha'agagi. Agagi is Agag. It's not Gaga. It's Agag. Who is Agag? Agag is the king of Amalek. Isn't it interesting that Shaul, who fought and got into trouble with the Amalekite, generations later, a descendant of Mordechai, Shaul, gets into trouble with a descendant of Amalek. That couldn't just have happened. Which means, again, our friend may be correct in saying that because of the problems in year 3, we get to year 11, and now according to this, because of the problems with Shaul in the days of Shmuel, later on we have the problems with Agag again, and with Mordechai versus Agag. Now this brings me to something else which is also very important here in chapter 2. And what we say is, one of the lessons of the Megillah is God always prepares the antidote before He gives us the poison. We're going to see pretty soon where we meet our friend the poison, Haman. But we now, in chapter 2, find that we are first meeting Mordechai, because Mordechai will be the antidote. As we say in Hebrew, Mikadem Refu'ah Labaka. First we meet Mordechai, and then we'll get to the Makkah, to Haman. Okay, let's continue. Naturally, my friend Shalamach, when he sings about Mordechai, he says, Asher hagla mirushalayim, im hagola asher hagleta, im Yechonya melech Yehuda. Again, Mr. Shalamach brings up the fact that Mordechai, the Jew, is a descendant of those who went through the Churban Beit HaMikdash. Now, let's go further, and then we find that Mordechai, again, the antidote, the medicine, he's already around. We already met him. And pretty soon we're going to meet Esther. But we also are going to find out that Mordechai happens to hear about a plot against King Achashverosh by two guys named Bigtan Viteresh, and it seems he listened into a conversation of theirs, and he knew that they wanted to kill the king, and he went and he snitched, and it was all written down, the antidote. And then some people say, how did Mordechai hear their conversation? Because Mordechai was a member of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, of the men of the Great Assembly, and the men of the Great Assembly had to know a number of languages in order for them to deal with any case of law. So they were talking Pidgin English, and how should they know that this Yid named Mordechai can speak and understand Pidgin English? And when they said, he understood what they were talking about. Okay, so we have that. And then we get, of course, to Esther, who is now also part of the antidote in the palace. And only after that we meet Achar Hadvarim Ha'ele in chapter 3, Gidal HaMelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata. Then we meet Haman, when we're ready with the antidote. So let's leave that and continue further. As I said, we're not going to do everything, but there are some things here that I think are extremely important. Now, Haman decides that he wants to kill the Jews, and he also you have to understand this, because this is typical anti-Semitism. It's great. Not that the anti-Semitism is great, but what happened here is so meaningful. What does Haman say? Let's make believe for a moment that I am Achashverosh. And as Haman is talking, I, Achashverosh, am saying, yep, Nachon, you're right, da-da. Listen to what Haman says. Vayomer Haman lemelech Achashverosh. Yeshno am echad, there is a nation, mefuzar umeforad bein ha'amim, b'chol medinot malchutecha. There's a nation that's all, they're mefuzar, they're scattered among all the nations. And Achashverosh says, yeah, well, I know who you're talking about. They sure are scattered. You know, you find them all over. For God's sake, and go nuts. Right, says Achashverosh. So Haman continues. And he says, V'dateim shonot mikol am. Their religion is different from every other religion. You know, they have this crazy idea about one God and all this kind of stuff. And Achashverosh again shakes his head and says, yep, you're right. They're spread out, and their religion is different. And then Haman says, Ve'et datei hamelech einam osim. And they don't follow the rules of the kingdom. And since Achashverosh had started, yup, you're right, he comes to the third part where it's yup, you're wrong, and he says, yup, you're right. That's the typical anti-Semite's way. And we saw this also in the Shoah. Okay? Anyhow, we won't go into why Haman so hated the Jews and why, etc., etc., etc. But now we're going to come to, as far as I am concerned, one of the main points of the Megillah, according to the Weinberg interpretation. We find as follows. Esther, the queen, is in place in the palace. Haman has already started his dirty work. Wants to kill the Jews. Everybody knows about it. And he says, Mordechai says to himself, I know what I have to do. I have to realize or understand what I said, that God makes the trufah before the makkah, the antidote before. The antidote here is Esther. I'm going to make sure that she helps us. And Mordechai goes in front of the palace, and he's wearing sackcloth, lavush sak. Esther is looking out of the window, and she sees Mordechai. He is her husband. He's not her husband. We won't go into that either. She sees Mordechai wearing sackcloth. And she says, oh my God, he must have lost money on the stock market. And now, for some reason, there's a problem. So what does she do? What does the Megillah say she does? What every good American Jew does. She sends him a check. How does she send him a check? We say as follows. Excuse me, in chapter 4, Vatishlach begadim lahalbish et Mordechai. Right? She sends him an outfit. Now here, Mordechai maybe doesn't understand what's going on. And here's where we're getting into the real stuff. And Mordechai, who assumes that Esther, the Connecticut Yankee, is trying to buy off Mordechai by sending him clothes, and with that will end the whole story. Mordechai gets very angry, and he says as follows, and this I feel I have to read it first in Hebrew, even though here the text doesn't really make that much of a business about it. And Mordechai says, and I quote, Mordechai says, I'm sorry. Al tidami benafshech. Don't think for a moment. Lehinatzel Beit HaMelech mikol HaYehudim. Don't think for a moment that because you're an American Jewish princess, don't think that you're going to be saved. Ki im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. If you'll be quiet now, if you won't stand up against Haman, revach v'hatzala ya'amod laYehudim mimakom acher va'at u'beit avich yovedu. The Jews will be saved from somewhere else if you're hiding from your goal. They will be saved, and you and your family are going to be lost. Umi yodea im la'et zot higat lamalchut. And who knows? Who knows why you became queen? Here I have to pause, because here the following true thing happened. I was giving courses in my home for many years, and naturally Purim time we would discuss the Megillah. And one year, when I got to this, one of my students, an elderly gentleman who I really didn't know, began crying. And at the end of the lecture, I went over to him and I said, I get the impression that in some way I offended you, and I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to. And he says to me, I'll explain myself soon, but maybe you want to elaborate on what you just said about Esther finding out that she can't get away with it, and that if she's going to try not to be Jewish, her family is going to be destroyed. So I said, okay, I'll continue. And here, my friend, is where I continue. And where I continued for him, and we'll get back to this wonderful gentleman in a few moments. I said, I sometimes like to go to movies. And I went to a movie that was called Ship of Fools. By the way, lahavdil elef havdalot, what they did with Ship of Fools, the original movie, they made it into Love Boat. I mean, let's forget that garbage. And the story of Ship of Fools was as follows, if I remember correctly, and I think I do. According to the maritime law at that time, a citizen of the country whose flag is flying on the mast of the boat have special privileges. We're dealing here with, after World War I, before World War II, a German boat in Bremerhaven going back home. On the German boat, all of the citizens of Germany have special privileges on that boat, because that's what's done. One of the privileges is that the German citizens on that boat dine in the captain's dining room and sit at the captain's table. You get it? Now here's what happened. We see the dining room. We see all the Germans sitting at the captain's table, and you know, they're all dressed the way Germans dress. Da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. And then the cameraman, or whoever it was, shows us another table. A small table. Tea for two. Da-da, da-da. A table for two. And there are two Germans sitting at that table, not with the other Germans. And these two are German citizens who cannot sit with all the other Germans, because one is a dwarf and the other is a goddamn Jew. They can't sit with the other German citizens. No, it's not enough? No, it's not enough, because then the director wants us to hear the conversation between them. And during the conversation between the dwarf German and the dirty Jew German, the Jewish German pulls out a medal and he shows it to the dwarf, and he says, "I am so proud that in World War I, the Kaiser himself gave me this medal." And he begins to cry. Hu mitragesh. He is so moved. And we're sitting in the theater and we want to shout, "Idiot! They're slapping your face. They're making you a fool. And you can still be proud of your German descent?" I never got over that. And I add that to the story of Al tidami benafshech lehimalet beit hamelech mikol haYehudim. Don't think you can get away with it, because you can't. And if you'll be quiet now, Revach v'hatzala ya'amod laYehudim mimakom acher, va'at u'beit avich yovedu. And we never learned it. We never learned that lesson. Then I finished the lecture. And the man comes over to me. And he tells me his name. And now he starts crying. And he says, "Why didn't my son hear your lecture? Do you know, my son had very leftish feelings. My son had an office in Jenin. He had an office where he took care at no cost of Arab terrorists, until one day an Arab came into his office and killed him. If my son would have heard your lecture before he became what he became, maybe he would still be alive." Friends, this is going to bring me to something else. The importance of Megillat Esther. The messages of Megillat Esther, and the fact that when we change it into some kind of a carnival, into what they call a festival, etc., etc., etc. I know when I came on Aliyah, my first Purim, sure, we in America also sometimes do a costume parties and this and that and the other thing. But the kids in school first learned Megillat Esther. And they learned the important things. And there are so many more. And I'm not going into everything. But again, I'm going back to my friend Shalamach. Balaylahu nadada. And he goes on, Shnat HaMelech. And these kids in the school, they haven't got the slightest idea what this is all about. They don't know that what Shalamach was saying then was that according to tradition, when the king couldn't sleep, the king isn't Stam a king. The king is Hashem. Melech Malchei Hamlachim. And therefore Shalamach sang Balayla hu nadada Shnat HaMelech. And these kids don't know what we mean when we say HaMelech, because they're not in shul, not even on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to hear HaMelech. And then we make a festival. It hurts. It definitely hurts. And now you see some of the things. I haven't touched on everything because it's not my job. Now, I will be very happy if every one of you gets a hold of a Megillat Esther with a translation in whatever language you want, and read the Megillah and think of some of these points, but think mainly that Am Yisrael Chai. La'ad.